My pleasure to be here and to be talking about what I think is a really cool topic, about how people represent the phonetic characteristics of their own dialect on social media. I'm going to start off briefly by outlining the kind of broad areas of interest that I think are relevant for this talk. So firstly, linguistic diversity, and with a particular focus on regional variation. So really asking the question, are there regional patterns of language use in informal writing? And do they correspond to the same dialectal patterns that we see in spoken language? Secondly, language use on social media, and of course, computer-mediated communication in its broader sense. Are people actually representing their own spoken dialect on social media? And if so, how are they doing that as well? And then finally, the results also speak to questions about language attitudes and the role of language in constructing and projecting some kind of social or regional identity. And hopefully I'll have some time at the end to talk a bit about that. So there's of course lots of factors that influence how we speak. I'm sure you're all aware of that. And the formality of the situation that we find ourselves in is, a major one. So we're all always involved in a constant process of style shifting, changing the way we speak depending on what we deem to be appropriate in a given context. And generally speaking, we are just likely to use fewer non-standard or stigmatized forms in more formal situations. And we can think about that across a range of different linguistic categories. So we can talk about lexical variation, the words that we choose to use in any one instance. Phonetic or phonological variation, so properties of the sounds in those words. And then also syntactic or grammatical variation, which is basically, the way we put those words together to form meaning. And to give just a few examples, of these, so lexical variation, we might think of people using the word friend as opposed to mate or pal. For phonetic variation, we might think about people saying city or city. And in terms of grammatical variation, we might think of people saying they were, or the kind of more non-standard, they was. Obviously not an exhaustive list, but these are probably the three main areas of variation that's often focused on in research into language variation and change. And that paradigm is usually applied to spoken language, but we can also analyze variation in written language through the same lens. And social media in particular is a great place to do that. It's a great place to look for linguistic diversity. It's obviously highly informal, so we might expect, just a lot more of that variability of the type I've just been talking about. People more likely to flout the conventions of standard language use when they're tweeting. And it's also in particular a great place to look for things like lexical innovations. And that kind of came up in the teaser video, if you've watched that on the Toolkit website. People using words like fleek and fuckboy and wrecked and so on. But also creative use of spelling. And, more recently, kind of the tension between punctuation and emoji use, which has often been the focus of discourse on youth language and internet language in recent times. And it's this notion of creative spelling that I'll be focusing on today. Because if we think back to those three categories of variation that I outlined on the previous slide, lexical, phonetic, and grammatical, with written language, we might think it's impossible to analyze phonetic variation. That would rely on us having spoken data, recorded language, actual audio files to analyze. But what we can do is look closely at orthographic variation instead, and in particular, the way that spelling choices can reflect interesting phonetic properties of the spoken word. So that's the study I'll be talking about today. It's something I was involved in a couple of years ago, recently published in a volume on dialect writing, specifically in the north of England. So I'll just spend a minute or so introducing this concept of dialect writing before going through the main results. It has very traditional roots in dialect literature. So, obviously the study I'll be talking about today is a much more modern spin on that, but it is a very traditional thing. And as the name suggests, it's the representation of a non-standard dialect in writing. And that can take many different forms. It might involve the use of regionally specific words. Great example is, variation in what we call a bread roll. People call it a roll, a bat, bam, muffin, cob, batch, tea cake. I think that's a relatively exhaustive list. So, that's a great example of lexical variation. But it might also involve things like kind of dialectal grammatical structures, or even dialectal respellings that reflect the phonetic characteristics of how those words are actually pronounced by these speakers. And that's, of course, the main focus of this talk. It's found across a range of texts, so we see it in poetry, in novels, cartoons, and as we'll see shortly, in tweets as well. And the reason why it's an interesting topic is that by studying dialect writing, it kind of lends insight into a number of interesting issues. So when dialects are represented in this way, it tells us something about the kind of cultural prominence of different linguistic features. What are the things that people call upon, writers, to authentically portray a certain dialect. And we also learn a bit about this idea of dialect enregisterment more generally. So, essentially a process where a linguistic repertoire, a kind of a way of speaking, becomes a socially recognized register of forms. And, a really extreme example of that is when you see certain dialects being stereotyped in the media or kind of commodified in the form of tourist souvenirs, car stickers, T-shirts, things like that. So this is just like one extension of that process. So here's I guess a traditional example. It's a picture I took from a Peter Lou exhibition in Manchester a few years ago. And it's a story written in this kind of dialect literature manner. So we see lots of features. I'll have to take a guess at what the writer was intending, the actual sound, but we see things like the word there being spelt like there, holding being spelt like holding or holding, right as reet, hour as iwer. We see reduction of and just to an, and plenty of other examples, shouting for shouting. We see vowel differences like tast and gav for taste and gave. So like I say, that's a very traditional example, and there's plenty of resources like that, like I say, poetry and also literature as well. Of course, today I'm more interested in things like this. This is an example of a real tweet, which was sent to Angela Rayner. So something like, "Hey up, Angela, thou munt take no notice of them soft southern jesses. If thou speaks with flat vowels, that's always considered thick." Great example, obviously with a lot of different features in there. So they're the kind of things we're looking at today. So the research question essentially is, to what extent the users of social media project their own dialects in social media posts, with a focus on Twitter, obviously, for now. And do these dialectal features show the same regional profile in writing as they do in speech? And to answer that question, we collected a lot of data. So we got 183 million tweets, all tagged with the exact latitude and longitude of where that person was in the world when they sent that tweet, which is kind of a bit creepy, but that data is collected sometimes by Twitter. I think most people have it turned off now. And that equates to almost 2 billion words, so a massive amount of data here. The book chapter itself covers 11 phonetic variables. I'll only talk about a handful today. So these are variables that were chosen carefully, really just to make sure that it's possible to reflect the dialectal sound in the spelling, which isn't always the case for all phonetic features. That's a topic that comes up in the classroom tasks that are available on the Toolkit website. And these are all features which, we know what to expect. If these are genuine kind of dialect phonetic forms, we know the kind of regional profile that they should show on Twitter. Okay, so the first example is the T to R rule. And this is people who say gera instead of get-a, or lora instead of lot of. Any other instance as well, where basically you get a t at the end of a word, and the next word is kind of an unstressed vowel like a or something. In speech, it's characteristic of Liverpool English. It's also found in Tyneside. And this is the map of the Twitter data. So the darker the colour, the more frequent the non-standard spelling. And we can see a similar kind of regional pattern here. So a concentration of the non-standard, gera, lora, in Liverpool, just over here, and also in the northeast, going down the eastern coastline, a bit into the Midlands as well. It's certainly less frequent in the south of England. There's some example tweets below. I'll put them up for every feature so you can look at those. So things like, so much for revising, you liar, get it off Twitter. One thing to notice is that overall, this is quite rare. So you might have noticed on this legend here, the postcode area where it's most frequent, it's still only used 1.1% of the time. So, it's not massively common, which is why we need a lot of data to look at this. But that makes sense, really, because, we're dealing with the written medium here, the strict constraints of those spelling conventions that don't apply in the same way when we're actually speaking. And it's a common theme across these results. We're looking at relative differences between areas, even if the overall kind of absolute frequencies are quite low across the board. And I will try and return to that point later. Another northern feature is the retention of the long oo vowel in words like mouth and house and down, any word with that ow vowel, basically. So it's people saying mooth instead of mouth, or doon instead of down. It's, again, said to be characteristic of Tyneside, but also Scots as well, and we absolutely see this here in the Twitter data. It's been said also that it's especially frequent in words that kind of enact a local identity. So in Newcastle, words like toon for town, or brown for brown, in reference to Newcastle brown ale. And we see an example below of it being used in that kind of context. So someone referring to the Doon Toon Banter. And like I say, on the Twitter data in our map here, it's very, very clear that it's most frequent in Scotland, and particularly in the northeast, and to an extent, Northern Ireland as well. So it does suggest, again, that we're seeing this being used by the same people who would be using it in the spoken form, and therefore a genuine case of dialect writing in this case. One other feature, and it's another northern feature, this time it's restricted specifically to Manchester, so it's what we call happy lexing. And again, happy is this lexical set, so it refers to not just the word happy, but any unstressed I vowel at the end of a word. So it could be happy, it could be city. And there's already variation in that vowel throughout the UK. Some people have a kind of tenser vowel, more like happy. Other people have a laxer vowel, more like happy. But in Manchester, a lot of speakers have a much laxer vowel where the tongue is even lower in the mouth, more like an eh sound. So something more like city, happy, which is very characteristic of Mancunian accents. And again, on Twitter, we see the expected pattern. So it's not clustered too strongly around Manchester, but we definitely see it used frequently there. I think that's Manchester. I should know I'm there now. And interestingly, we actually see the highest rates in particular for the word city. And it's a highly salient feature of the local Manchester accent. So it's kind of no surprise that it might be encoded in the word city and in stereotypes of people who support Manchester City Football Club, basically. And what's interesting is that, like I say, it's used a lot in Manchester, also kind of the surrounding areas in the northwest. We do see it elsewhere as well, particularly around London, actually, which is interesting. And what's cool is that we've looked into this in a bit more detail, and a lot of those cases where it's being used by people outside of Manchester, it's kind of specifically the word city. So it could be related to that cultural stereotype. It could be users on Twitter who are probably Man City fans all over the country, using this spelling to index that kind of footballing allegiance, even if it's not actually a feature of their own spoken dialect. But again, we see it extended to other words, so things like, oh yes, so happy to be eating chicken nugs, which I assume is a truncated form of chicken nuggets. Now you might be thinking at this point, hold on, these are all northern features. So is it not just a case of like northern Twitter users in general being more likely to tweet in a kind of non-standard way? But this is a variable with closer ties to the south of England. This is TH stopping, which is the realization of th and the sounds as the plosives t and d instead. So people are saying den instead of then, or ting instead of thing. And of course, Paul Kurzweil was talking about this with reference to multicultural London English before. It does have its origins in MLE, but it's also been claimed that the form has kind of generalized. It's now a wider characteristic of the performance of ethnic identity or of urban varieties more generally, as opposed to being a quite restricted regional marker. Now, in terms of our Twitter data, we do see a clear pattern emerge. So it's very much used, frequently in the south, in the southeast, around London. But you see it is creeping up into the Midlands around here, around Birmingham especially. And, we know there are significant minority ethnic groups around there. And we see a small hotspot again in Manchester here, which would kind of support the idea that it's maybe less so a London-centric form, maybe more now a feature of just kind of these urban varieties. And notice again in these examples, a really interesting thing is that we often see co-occurrence of multiple features together. So it's rarely just one feature appearing on its own. It's usually more a collection of phonetic spellings that are used in tandem to contribute to this kind of portrayal of the spoken form. So we see, lexical variation, fam, dis, trip, every day is just a long ting. So we've got a couple of th stop in there. We've got td deletion, again, a very frequent form in speech where you kind of delete the t or the d at the end of a word if another consonant comes before it. And again, d's man, just, td deletion again, vex in my life. So it's really interesting that we often see these, a lot of different features co-occurring together. One of the more common phonetic spellings is actually the dropping of the G in words like eating, running, laughing, etc. It's a feature that's been attested all over the world in loads of varieties of English. And it's usually a strong social marker, so linked to things like social class, level of education, age, or gender. In the UK, it's been claimed that it's more of a regional variable than a social variable. So Northerners and people in Scotland, especially using the G-dropped form a lot more frequently than the rest of England and the UK. And that's quite interesting. It mirrors the historical origins of that variable from hundreds of years ago, which is quite cool. And we see the same thing once again on Twitter. So we can see very much used frequently in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and in the Northwest in particular, not just the north of England, but the Northwest, and very rare down south. Now, not all of the variables show the expected pattern, but some interesting things crop up in those that don't. So there are two features here that I want to talk about: letter backing, which is another Mancunian feature, where people pronounce the kind of schwa vowel at the end of words like Manchester, more like o, and also words like letter, hence why we call it letter backing. So these people would say something more like letter, Manchester. And also the footstrut split, which is a real north-south divide in England. And so Southerners pronouncing words like bus and cut, more like bass and cat, and people in the north saying things more like bus and cut. And again, it's a feature that can be registered in the place name where that feature is typically associated. So Manchester and London. And in these cases, it looks like we actually see the opposite pattern. So we see with the kind of the London spelling, it's actually used less frequently in the southeast compared to the rest of the country. And for Manchester, I mean, there's just no real pattern there. It is used a bit around the northwest, but no clear cluster in there. So it looks like we see in the case of dialect imitation, which is why they're cropping up in places we don't expect. It's people kind of imitating the dialect, and that effect is registered most strongly in place names that are associated with that dialect. And again, another great example of co-occurrence of features here. Apparently I sound like I'm from South London when I'm drinking. So you've got the vowel difference, a very kind of Cockney R vowel, the monophongisation there. We've got TH fronting, the th going to a th. And of course, we've got the strut vowel in London as well. Okay, I'm going to skip this because I'm going to go over. I'm aware of the time. We can also talk about it in the questions. If you're interested, just a few kind of caveats when we work with this kind of data. But what we've seen here is a really clear pattern. We've seen a strong parallel between the written and the spoken forms of these dialect features. And that's really reassuring. We've seen genuine cases of phonetically motivated orthography, which shows that that process of dialect and registerment that I talked about earlier, and that's been attested in literary and artistic contexts. This is kind of being used with similar purposes by the speech community on social media platforms. And it's interesting because it tells us something quite cool about the salience of these features, the social prominence, the fact that these features are being used as stereotypes of a dialect, presumably with the intention that readers will see the forms being used and understand what kind of spoken features the writer was trying to convey. And in doing that, we learn a lot about how people utilize these features in a socially meaningful way to construct and project a linguistic and a social identity. And that's what we mean by, identity construction. It's not just the use of language to communicate some information, but the use of particular features to communicate something about who we are and how we want to be perceived as well. So very quickly, I want to just make a point about language attitudes. I mean, unsurprisingly, a lot is made of youth language and how social media is destroying the English language, which, is untrue. But it's a widespread misconception. You don't have to look too far to find quotes and headlines like these. I won't read them out, they're there for you on the slide. But the important point is that, in this case at least, these social media violations of spelling conventions are no different to the kind of traditional forms of dialect writing and poetry we've seen for hundreds of years. The only difference here is that, it's young people doing it on their phones, hence the criticism. And some of the most celebrated literary works of all time. So in Wuthering Heights, we see the character Joseph and this representation of 19th century Yorkshire dialect features. Yeah, good for nout. I was sure he'd sarve you out. There were nout like this when I were a lad, and so on. It's the same thing. And just to prove my point, I actually lied to you all. Two of these features aren't from Wuthering Heights at all, but they're actually real tweets from our data set. But hopefully that wasn't obvious to you, which kind of proves the point. It's the same thing. It's creative use of language to index certain social meanings and to project this identity that would otherwise be masked if we were conforming to, the standard conventions of written language and spelling. And, if it's good enough for Emily Bronte, then it's good enough for the rest of us, I would say. So final take-home message then is that informal mediums like Twitter and others are a real hotbed of linguistic innovation and diversity and creativity. And I've shown today that we've got very strong evidence for saying that people choose to create and broadcast social media posts that are written in a way which more closely reflects their own spoken accent. And this variation in spelling then, it's a violation, of the kind of strict conventions of spelling, but it's orderly and systematic, and it has nothing to do with a laziness or a decline in the English language. It just represents a more obvious form of identity construction that we already see in spoken language. And it's more obvious because it's something we can see with our own eyes. It requires a much more deliberate and conscious action to type the words in this way, compared to some of the variation we see in speech, which might be a bit more below the radar. And that itself is interesting. It tells us something about, the intentions of the user. Okay, that's everything. Thanks for listening. Well, thanks for listening, I should say.